Hello and welcome to this week's module on andragogy. To some people, the term andragogy is synonymous with adult learning, and this module will both draw in much of your previous learning and set the stage for our last few topics. Part of what I want to accomplish in the video today is to provide some context on where this term andragogy, as a contrast to pedagogy, comes from. And I want you to help you think about how the andragogical principles you will read about in Merriam and Birma relate to instruction and training. Fundamentally have two objectives in this module. One is to perhaps go back and revisit your definition of adult learning that we started with in the first week, build on a bit more in week 2. And as you come into really understanding the principles of andragogy this week, to perhaps refine your ongoing working definition of what adult learning really means. You're going to learn about 6 core principles of andragogy that come from the work of Malcolm Knowles. And I want you to be able to apply those to deepen understanding of your own learning experiences in school, in the workplace, or in your learning experiences for personal enrichment. Since the beginning of humankind, adults learned from one another and taught each other in experiential ways. Even the great schools of Greece 2,500 years ago focused on the education of adults. And this learning was active and it engaged the learners. Teachers were mostly in the background, watching and facilitating as needed. But when the first Western European universities opened in late medieval times, a new tradition of adult learning arose, where experts that had access to information in a few handwritten books, remember this was prior to the advent of the printing press, would read lectures to audiences who transcribed the lectures into notes in their own books with varying degrees of attentiveness, as is obvious in this picture, to the presentation. Hence was born a tradition of experts transmitting knowledge to passive learners. The teacher-centered approach to learning subsequently permeated the schooling of children, which was uncommon prior to the 18th century. It became expected preparation of children for work in industry and agriculture during the growth of industrialized economies in the late 19th century. And this approach, very teacher-centered, continues to the present in American public schooling. The didactic approach also became dominant in higher education in North America, extending to the present day, where most education and teaching and learning takes place in environments and settings like shown in these pictures. The practice of education in school, including college, became known as pedagogy. The etymology of the term pedagogy draws from Greek roots that literally mean to lead a child. The syllable ped having the same root meaning in this case that is also found, for instance, in pediatrics. Although the term has generally been broadened to represent the practice of education more generally, it is this focus on child that captures our attention at the moment. With the considerable expansion of adult education programs in the United States during the 1960s, several educators and researchers, most notably Malcolm Knowles, proposed that pedagogical models of education that were familiar to teachers, not only of children, but also teachers of adults, were inappropriate for adult learning beyond the context of school. Knowles drew attention particularly to the importance of viewing education within the context of the social roles of the learners. For children, the social role focuses strongly on being a student and advancing by grades through their education. The social roles for adults are related to being workers, spouses, and parents with educational needs that are related to those roles. And given that so much of the practice of education in the 18th century onward was toward educating children in schools, that is, pedagogy, the question arose as to whether the principles arising from this approach to education and the training of teachers also related appropriately to adults. So in this case, adults are meaning people beyond school age and pursuing learning in general for 3 reasons. With a goal orientation, meaning clear-cut objectives that usually relate to furthering competency on one or more of those social roles. An activity orientation that's motivated primarily by desire for human interaction. And a learning orientation that is motivated to learn for the sake of learning. So in continuation of this line of thinking, Knowles used the term andragogy to contrast with the literal meaning of pedagogy and the focus on learning in school. The etymology of andragogy draws from andra, a Greek word specifying man, not boy, or in other words, not a term that focuses only on male gender, but particularly of importance in this case, focusing on maturity, adulthood. It's also worth keeping in mind that Knowles didn't actually coin this term, although it's associated with him very strongly in the literature. As a term, andragogy appeared in Europe in the 1830s. And the critical element in Europe, in terms of contrasting andragogy and pedagogy, is that adults should assist one another to become more refined and competent as a goal of andragogy, whereas pedagogy is about assisting a child to become an adult. This diagram probably looks familiar. We've looked at it in a couple of the previous warm-up videos. And if you stare at it for a moment, maybe come back to it as you're reading this week, you'll see that really this sort of flow chart of ideas that are the framework for adult learning captures the essence of andragogy as advocated by Knowles. Your reading will describe Knowles' 6 core principles of adult learning, and I'd like to take just a few minutes to introduce them to you here, along with some thoughts about their implications for delivering educational opportunities to adults. The first thing to appreciate about Knowles' model of andragogy is that it is a transactional model. That means that it focuses on the characteristics of knowledge acquisition by an individual. Andragogy is a model for individual learning, not for organizational learning. It also is not a model that presupposes or prescribes the goals that the learner has for their learning. The first principle focuses on the idea that adults, more so than children, need to know why they should learn something. From a teacher or trainer standpoint, this principle makes explicit to us the need for clear objectives, what the learner will know or be able to do after the learning experience, and why this learning is important to accomplish. The second principle is that adults are more likely to be intrinsically rather than extrinsically motivated for learning. Achieving a grade is not the usual applicable motivation. This means that instruction of adult learners needs to design learning tasks that have clear, explicit benefits for the learners. Next is the appreciation that most adults enter into a learning experience with some problem to solve, skill to master, or some other goal that will be best accomplished by learning activities that focus on doing rather than knowing. Next is the appreciation that adult learning, or andragogy rather, more specifically, does not presume or prescribe the learner's goals, but acknowledges that a readiness to learn is greatest when the learning opportunity connects to the adult's social roles as a worker, a public or community servant, a parent, a spouse, etc. This means that the instructional design should focus on tasks that are authentic to those roles. Also, unlike children, adults bring substantial life and work experience that will likely be relevant to the new learning objectives. An effective instructor draws these out, both to respect the knowledgeable nature of the learners and to know where the existing knowledge can serve as a foundation for new learning. This is the importance of prior knowledge concept that you read about a few weeks ago in Ambrose. And we also know from our previous experience with this topic that prior knowledge can include misconceptions. So instructors need to be aware of corrections of prior knowledge that may become necessary as a part of the teaching or training. And the last principle is perhaps the most important one, and is the topic for all of next week's module, actually. This principle relates to the learner's self-concept, which for adults is assumed to include a greater sense of responsibility for learning than in the case of children, and also a greater ability and desire for self-directed learning. As I mentioned in our brief consideration of self-directed learning in a previous module, this means that learners are setting the goals for their learning, determining a learning plan or pathway, and monitoring their learning progress through metacognition and self-regulation. One of the controversies surrounding these 6 principles of andragogy is whether they mean that andragogy represents a theory of adult learning. Knowles made that claim in his initial publications in the 1970s, but did later back down in face of some rather substantial criticism. The issue really comes down to, do these principles really define characteristics of learning in adulthood that are unique to adults and always present in adults? Knowles thought so because of the changing social roles of the learners. But increasingly, we know that learning is a characteristic of the human brain, And it is difficult, if not impossible, to identify clear differences in how the brain processes information in childhood versus adulthood. For instance, we know that prior knowledge is a critical foundation to new learning at any age. In addition, self-directed learning does appear in adolescents and even some younger children. On the other hand, not all adults turn out to be self-directed learners and need quite a bit of direction from a teacher in order to learn. So Knowles retreated from branding andragogy as a theory. Instead, he called it a model of assumptions or a set of core principles of adult learning that are related to characteristics that in total are more likely found in adults learning in a non-academic setting than for younger people learning in school. Notably, even Knowles and other advocates of andragogical principles of adult learning admit that the age distinction for andragogy versus pedagogy may be more a construct of our education system than it is the maturation of human learning capacity and concept of learning. In this schematic graph from the most recent edition of Knowles' textbook, which has been carried on after his death by other authors, we're schematically looking at on the graph, as shown in the y-axis on the left, the degree of self-directedness in the learning process versus a concept of learner on the part of the learner and the teachers that learning is dependent on others, particularly the teacher. And the x-axis in a schematic way showing maturation of a human through time. And you see these two fields, the blue and the yellow. And essentially what the andragogy advocates point out is that if you focus on self-directed self-concept of learning, andragogy should substantially replace teacher-centered pedagogy by the time someone is 18 years old. Nonetheless, they accept that in reality, pedagogy persists to later ages, where they would feel in this field that's labeled where pedagogy is practiced, but in their mind is inappropriate, a greater degree of self-direction and tying into learner motivations and needs should be key to the learning process, where they would argue that andragogy is more appropriate, but isn't actually practiced. In essence, according to this thesis, the cultural construct of formal education promotes pedagogical approaches beyond the age where learners should be taking more responsibility and self-direction in their learning. Early in the semester, I showed this diagram during a warm-up video to show schematically how I think about concepts of adult learning and andragogy when developing professional learning programs for faculty in my role as a faculty developer. Much college classroom instruction would be represented by the descriptors on the left. Learning with the core principles of andragogy would be represented by the descriptions on the right. While knowing that some objectives and content requirements are specified by the need for the training, I always strive to develop a program that moves the sliders to the right. So what's in my mind as I thought about developing and teaching this course? On one hand, everyone in the class is a biological adult. Most of you are in social roles that we associate with adulthood, including careers that make use of adult learning principles, whether you are aware of that or not before taking this course. So one could readily imagine any of you pursuing an entirely self-directed course of study that would move the sliders all the way to the right. But we also have to appreciate that we're at a university and this is a course with objectives that were set by curriculum requirements for a degree. And they have the course has graded assessments that are intended to determine the achievement of those objectives. Those include some of the elements of school learning that are on the left. My intention in designing and leading the course is to have an appropriate mix of these concepts from both sides of the diagram that includes engaging your interests, experiences, and individual learning goals that allow you to determine to a significant extent the direction of learning in all of the graded assignments. So I'd be inclined to place the sliders in these positions. What do you think? So as you move forward in your further study of andragogy this week, here are a couple things I'd like you to think about in the context of our learning objectives. One would be, can you relate Knowles' 6 core principles to your own learning experiences? And can you use those principles to differentiate your learning at different ages? It might be interesting to kind of keep in the back of your mind, what would a course or training that was based only on andragogy look like? Looking forward to seeing how you engage with the topic of andragogy in your 4R assignments this week. Adios.